Namaste. Welcome to Androidiots podcast. I am Anupam Singh.
I am Tushar Gupta. We talk about what's new in Android, best practices, and how to be a better Android developer.
So hi guys, today we have Ayush and Siddhant. Ayush is working at LinkedIn. Siddhant is working at Urban Lab. And also with me, my co-host is Himanshu today. That's all. Over to you.
So hi guys, my name is Ayush. I work for LinkedIn Profile. I've been working at LinkedIn since 2016. I started off working on Android. I was actually an intern there for 3 months before that as well. So I started off working on Android. I built a bunch of features for LinkedIn Profile, and then I decided to switch tracks because of a moment of passion. And I was like, oh, maybe I should switch to an iPhone development gig because I have an iPhone myself. So I was like, I want to build something that I have. So I've been working on iOS since February 2017. It's been a couple of years almost now. So it's been fun. My work primarily involves pretty much everything that you see on LinkedIn Profile, from viewing to editing to sub features like marketplaces, summaries, experience, browse maps, viewing them, maintaining them, editing them. I've also done a bunch of back-end stuff like built Hadoop flows for custom jobs, but that's been more of an interest thing. So that's a bit about me.
Siddhant.
Yeah, hi guys, I'm Siddhant. I recently joined Urban Clan. So I was Ayush's roommate in SF and went to college with him. And I moved back to India 3-4 months ago after working in San Francisco, and I joined the growth team at Urban Clan.
So that's good. So I guess Ayush, you can talk about how is life at LinkedIn.
Life is very interesting at LinkedIn. So initially, since I was an intern there, it's been a while now. I was an intern there in 2015, which is a good 3 years ago. And back then, we weren't acquired by Microsoft. We were an independent company, and B, the development community was significantly smaller than it is now. And if you know stuff about LinkedIn, we have a suite of applications. It's not just one flagship application that I work on, which is LinkedIn.com, but we also have like a Profinder application, a careers application, and all of those are standalone apps for both iOS and Android. So initially when I joined LinkedIn as an intern, we were going through this massive rewrite of our complete application because if you remember, for the longest time we had like a very arcane old application which wasn't responsive, it wasn't reactive, right? So when I joined as an intern, I was working on the Android application and how we were rewriting it, specifically the profile editing portion. And life was like very, very fast moving at that point. We were putting in like at least 1,500 to 2,000 lines of code in every day. That was very, very fast moving. So we came out with this project, which is public now. It's called Project Voyager, which is an entire rewrite, and it completely changed the way not just we built the mobile application, but also like our entire server infra at the back end, and the way LinkedIn.com was being served to the user. But over time, it's become like significantly more. It's become more careful and more craftsmanship oriented, is how I would put it. It's not just like now when I see LinkedIn, it's not just about pushing out new features, but it's also more about like how to deal with things at scale, how to make sure that the people who are joining LinkedIn are more like onboarded in the right way, and how their career growth, which we can get to later, is like impacted, right? So it's a lot more focus on not just writing fast code, but also writing good code that doesn't break in the future, right? Because you can always hack your way through building a feature and like meet product requirements. But to do that at scale is a different ballgame.
Talking about scale, one thing Android bugs us a lot is, say, fragmentation.
Yeah.
And at a LinkedIn scale, and to optimize the UI is one of the, I guess, the most important thing for you guys.
Yeah.
So how you guys go about that?
Yeah, so for Android specifically, there's been a large push for mobile in general, but even for Android, because there's significant challenges that come with Android that don't come with other mobile clients. Like there was Windows Phone that we were supporting earlier, but not anymore, or iOS for that matter. And those challenges come in the forms of like different API versions, different screen sizes, stuff that you build on like say a Nexus might break on like a Galaxy tablet, right? Like stuff like that is very, very specific to Android. So the stuff that we deal with on an everyday basis in terms of UI optimization is focused a lot around the infra and the infrastructure that we have to make sure that all the tests that we run or like the code that we put in or like the UI testing that we do is very, very exhaustive in terms of the use cases that we cover, right? And there's an entire regression test pipeline that we run on a bunch of devices, right? And there's an internal tooling system that we use, which takes care of a lot of these things for us. Where, for instance, if I'm writing like an adapter for a recycler view, I don't need to worry about how it would behave on like a different tablet because my regression test will already take care of that. Apart from like talking about testing, it's not just like say unit testing; it's also layout testing to make sure like your UI is not breaking on a bunch of different devices. The scenario testing. There's like a bunch of other test cases that we cover. But in general, it's fairly straightforward from a development standpoint, where as a new Android developer who comes into LinkedIn and is writing code that is going to be pushed out to 500 million users, he doesn't have to worry about, oh, will this code like break on a different device. In the early days when we were writing the application, when we were building that infrastructure from the ground up, in that respect, we had like a lot of those concerns. But now a lot of those concerns are like alleviated because we have a dedicated infrastructure team to manage all that, right? And they deal with the tools and how we run that on simulators and how we test that on like different devices. So a lot of those concerns are mitigated to a large extent. And as someone who works on like the back end of where the user meets LinkedIn, right? Like LinkedIn profile is basically what the user is interacting with. I don't need to worry about different tooling concerns or infra concerns and how like that goes on behind the scenes now as much. Earlier there was a time when we had to do a bunch of manual testing and like make sure like we have these devices and like stuff isn't going crazy on each of these devices. But now a lot of those concerns are like kind of mitigated.
So basically, it's a sort of test lab, right?
Yeah, so there's this test lab, but we call it the regression pipeline. It's essentially automating a large amount of test cases, and pretty much every time you check in code, you're not allowed to check in code that would fail any test. So if any developer comes in and breaks some sort of like existing layout test, or like there's other concerns there also, like internationalization, like we operate in a bunch of countries, right? And stuff like if I have a hard-coded string, for instance, welcome to LinkedIn, something as simple as that, that in Russian will be a 3-line string, right? Whereas in English, it'll just be a single-line string. So your UI will just become like a card that says welcome ... right? And stuff like that you don't want to happen, right? So the regression pipeline takes care of that because the internationalization and stuff is run on a bunch of different devices, and it's made sure that they test it in like, I think we support more than 30 languages. So like it tests like all those 30 languages, make sure that the UI doesn't break, and generates screenshots for all of them, right? So manually you can look at what it looks like in different languages to make sure like it doesn't break.
So how is the UI control driven by backend in LinkedIn, right? So basically, you need to run those test labs after changing everything on backend also, because the UI is controlled by backend.
Yeah.
You need to, because if a string changes, it's same as multi-line or something.
Right. So this is a more recent development where there's been a larger push towards making UI more closely coupled with the backend, right? Where the backend is very, very aware of how the UI will be displayed. Earlier, what used to happen was that the client application by itself was the one that was handling like all of this stuff, and even all these strings and stuff were kind of auto-generated. Like there were scripts that were generating this stuff, but it was largely handled client side. Now, as you mentioned, like because of this recent push towards making things more server side, the server has become more aware, and the tests that you write on the server are now more aware of what the UI should look like.
So most of your unit test cases will move to server also on that layer, something you can call it as a presentation layer or something. You need to unit test it, right?
Right. So the thing that I was trying to get at was there is a push to do that, but it's not as closely coupled. Like the server will not completely give you the layout. We still use XML on our Android, and like a lot of the data will be served from the server side, and a lot of the decoration components, like for instance, if I have a template and I want to if I have a template for a promo, right, and I want to display that promo in different forms or shapes on different profiles, the server would tell me, okay, this is the promo, and I need to decorate it in this fashion, given this font size or this string or like whatever extra components I need to know from the UI side, and that I can just store in my item model and just pass it in through my data binding pipeline, right, to directly to my layout. So a lot of that stuff is kind of abstracted away to the server now. And as that push grows, like as we move towards like a more server side UI type coupling, the test cases would automatically be taking care of that on the server side.
You guys must also have a very interesting release cycle then. In case if that is
Yeah.
covered, so we
Yeah.
can start off with how you guys, let's say example, a PM comes with a feature,
Right.
and till the point of actually a build is released.
Yeah.
You can just briefly, can you just briefly walk us through what all
Sure.
happens between that?
Yeah, sure. So the thing is, a lot of it varies by team. Let me just preface what I'm going to say by that. A lot of it depends on how each team functions, and there's a lot of autonomy in how every team functions because there's a variety of teams. Like there's growth, there's identity, there's profile, there's feed. There's a bunch of teams, right? So usually what happens is like the engineering manager and the product manager would decide on the direction that they want to go in, and they would come up with like a feature, for instance, right? Then they would come to the engineering team, and there would be like a design discussion with the designer and the product manager, where we sit down and we decide, okay, we put our point of view forward. We're like, okay, this is what we like, this is what we don't like. We don't think this is going to move the needle. This is not as impactful, or this is stuff that we like. Now, once that happens, then we start building like whatever we have to build in terms of the dev cycle, right? We use up dev cycles and we include test cases while writing dev cycles to make sure like everything is integrated. For instance, if 3 people are working on the same feature, then I want to make sure that the stuff that I'm putting out doesn't break his stuff, right, or her stuff. So they would want to put in the test cases along with their code. So now we have this recent push on my team and a bunch of other teams where we don't check in code without associated tests. Usually what ends up happening is that because there's a deadline to meet, the PM is like, why don't you deliver this by this timeline? We have to move the metric. Just put it out there. Now we've reached a stage, because our code base is like significantly larger. We have like more than 600K lines of code. So because of that, we are at a stage where we need to ensure that the stuff that we're checking into the code base isn't being affected by any other person's code, right? And since, as I mentioned, the regression pipeline at the beginning is like as exhaustive, we want to make sure that it stays that way, because if we are not writing those tests, that pipeline loses its value, right? So we check in like those tests initially, and then we come to the release point, which is to answer your question. So for Android specifically, we do this thing called 3x3, right? And when I started the podcast, I mentioned like when I was an intern, there was a complete rewrite going on. So the complete rewrite, one of the major aspects of that was not just the UI redesign, was also the release cycle. And that release cycle was called 3x3. What 3x3 actually stands for is that the time it takes for a developer to push code all the way till it reaches production, including running all the test suites in the background, running it on a bunch of different devices, running all the internationalization tests on it, should take 3 hours. What that would allow you to do is a developer that checks in code at 9 a.m., that code would be in production at 12 p.m. And that way we can release 3 times a day. So we can release at 9 a.m., we can release at 12 p.m., and we can release at 3 p.m. And that the web version, like what you see on LinkedIn.com right now, is released 3 times a day. So the code that I'm writing today in the morning, it'll be in front of you at 12 p.m. Right? That's the goal. So how that manifests itself on like an Android and iOS scale is that since we can't release the APK that often, we release it 3 times a week. So we do it Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and the Monday beta goes to production on Wednesday. So pretty much everything that we do, the beta train will leave. So it's very, very set that the stuff that you want to get in, you have to make sure that it gets into the beta. If you don't get into the beta, then there's no push for you to be like, okay, let's re-release this. Because since there's a bunch of teams working on it, you will want to make sure like everyone's stuff is going in on time. An added benefit of that is that since there's 3 releases, you don't feel the pressure to make the beta thing, right? If you miss the Wednesday beta, you can make the Friday beta. If you miss the Friday beta, you can come. You don't have to work on the weekend. You can come back in on Monday and make the Monday beta, right? Since it's so frequent, you don't feel the need to meet a deadline. And that was one of the bigger pushes. Because what ends up happening is that since in most places there's a deadline to meet, the closer you get to the deadline, the lower your code quality becomes. Because you're like, I have to put this in to production by 12 p.m. and it's 10 p.m. and I need to just hack my way through it. And because of that, your code quality would dip. You would skimp on writing some tests, or you would skimp on like exhausting out your testing or like building out that feature properly. And that is very, very important because we would rather, at LinkedIn, it is very important for us, given our scale, that we don't ship stuff that breaks, right? And because of that, it's very important. We might as well delay it by 2-3 days. That's fine, as opposed to putting out stuff where people complain. Because if we put out something that breaks, then TechCrunch will pick it up. Or like, Y Combinator is going to start shitting on you, right? So we have to be mindful of the scale in that respect. And that's why the release cycle kind of takes care of that. It alleviates a lot of developer pain because they don't feel the need to meet this constant deadline, right?
So basically, you talked about multiple teams putting code all together. So is there some sort of a central or a foundation team that looks after the releases or something? Because might be difficult to manage between teams.
Right. So as I mentioned, there's a bunch of applications that we have at LinkedIn, right? One is obviously LinkedIn.com, but there's also ProFinder and there's Careers and stuff, right? So each team has like an associated tools and infra team, and they are responsible for just releasing the beta. A lot of the stuff that you mentioned, like since there's a bunch of teams already collaborating and they're working on different components, right? The regression part of it is already automated. So the infra team basically looks at it's releasing the beta is pretty much as simple as just pushing a button. I just release it to the App Store. And from what I remember, they've integrated with Slack now, so a bot does that. So it's pretty much completely automated, unless there's like a very good like major problem which is blocking the release, which is going to impact like revenue by a significant amount, in which case you have to block the release. Or this is not Android specific, but in iOS's case, sometimes Apple would throw a fit and be like, we're not going to approve because you didn't meet some guideline, right? So there's other intricacies there, but largely it's very, very automated. And in other cases, like the infra team would be responsible for not just releasing the beta, but also like ensuring that it's performant, it meets like certain size constraints. The APK is sliced, and like because it's such a large APK, you can't just dump it in one binary. You want to slice it. So that kind of stuff is handled by the infra team, not by the consumer teams.
And what if something breaks on production? Let's say hypothetical scenario.
Yeah. So this is a complete pipeline that happens if something breaks in production, and the way we find out about that is also very interesting. So A is obviously user reports. B is we have an internal monitoring system where we track like whatever metrics we are looking at for a specific feature, right? And we track those specific metrics by looking at like whatever the product manager has initially told us, like this is what we're going to look at for a specific feature. We look at those internal graphs and we look at if any metric starts dipping significantly, we know something is off, right? Like if there's a baseline established, then we know something is off. The same goes for performance. Like if your performance for profile loads, for instance, goes down, then I know that something is wrong in the way I'm making AMPA requests. And because of that, the on-call, so to speak, for every team is going to monitor like a bunch of metrics and make sure like everything is as it's supposed to be. The other thing is obviously user reports. So we get a bunch of user reports and who tell us like this UI is off, this is going wrong. In that case, there's a triaging process where we look at each of those things and we make sure like the person is on the latest build and like all those preliminary boxes are checked off, and then it gets assigned to a developer who can like take a look at it. Usually it's the person who's built the feature or the team that owns that feature. They take a look at it. For instance, if something is going wrong on profile, they come to my team. If something is going wrong on feed, then we'll go to some other team. And the developer associated with it would look at that bug and is responsible for triaging it. So that is a common theme at LinkedIn where people don't just write code and move on from it. Ownership of code is very, very important, and that is why people actually make a lot of effort to write good code as opposed to writing fast code. Like fast code is and low-hanging fruit and an easy win, right? But if you're writing fast code and your code is breaking again and again, and you're getting a lot of user reports where people are like, hey, this feature is working, but this is off, right? That should tell you that there's less ownership. So at LinkedIn, we have this culture of a lot of ownership. So if you own a certain code, then anything wrong with that code, you're going to own that, as well as like its test suite and its maintenance, right? So you get a lot of ownership, and once you see that code in production, it's quite fulfilling in that respect also.
Okay, I guess we learned a lot. One last question is, what it takes to be a LinkedIn engineer?
That's very interesting. So there's no one thing that it takes to be a LinkedIn engineer. I can only tell you my experience of what it was like.
That would be
Yeah, so I was actually in college when I applied to LinkedIn and I applied to Google and Facebook and all these like plethora of big companies, right? And then I went through the entire process, which essentially for an intern it consists of like a couple of interviews on the phone, where they'll test you for your technical skill and make sure your personality is a good fit. And then based on that, then you'll be brought on site and you'll meet like a bunch of engineers from LinkedIn, and they would like sit you in a room, take you out for lunch, make sure that your personality is a good fit. Not just that your technical skill is good, but make sure that, oh, would I want to actually work with this guy? Like that's a very big concern because they want to make sure that the culture is very collaborative, right? It's not just you can be technically very, very capable, but if you're not willing to help out other people, then you would not make a good team player, right? So all that stuff happens on site. And once that is true, then you're in this phase where you've cleared all your interviews, right? And then you would be given a bunch of teams whose managers you would be asked to talk to. And you can talk to those managers, you can interact with them, ask them about what their teams are doing, and these would be completely different on your interests. Like if you're an Android engineer, you would be focused more on like consumer teams. If you're like a back-end engineer who works on Hadoop, you probably want to work on feed relevance at the back end, right? Because that's where the meat of the stuff is. So you talk to a bunch of these managers, and then you talk to them about how you'd be a fit on each of their teams. And once that happens, then they would extend you an offer. That's how you go through it as an intern. It's largely the same for a full-time employee. There's a few more interviews. Like there's obviously going to be coding and algorithms and system design and that kind of stuff that you focus on. But also like the personality fit is very, very important. Like I specifically remember where one of my friends was interviewing at LinkedIn, and he went through the entire interview and he was like, it went completely fine. And then like this guy was a perfectionist of sorts, right? So he was very, very into like, I don't just need to get the solution right. I want to make sure I have the optimized solution in hand, right? So he went through the interview process, and at one point, like he came back and he told me, like at one point, I was just like, I give up because the time was running out. Like it's a 1 hour interview, and this guy couldn't solve the entire problem, and he's like, I give up. And even though he had crushed the remaining part of the interview, like he had got all the questions, they didn't extend him an offer. And that's like kind of very demonstrative of how the hiring works. Like if you're not someone who can work through those challenges, because those are challenges that you'll see every day, it won't make a good fit. So fit is very important. And there's 3 pillars that are often emphasized on LinkedIn, and they're the core values that we value at LinkedIn. One is obviously execution, which most companies value, right? Like you have to deliver in terms of like the code that you're writing. The other 2, which are more like, if you think about the more subtle, are like leadership. Like how much of a leader are you? How much do people come to you for help? Are you actually collaborative? Are you helping out people around you and building that team spirit? That's the second one. And the third one is craftsmanship, which is you're not just putting out these features, you're actually building them in a way that when you leave the company, someone else can take them over and not be like, hey, what the hell did this guy do? But it's more like, oh, there's a good engineer who was here and who built decent code and didn't just bounce from here with leaving us with something that is large and hairy to deal with, right? So a lot of emphasis is placed on like your career development, not just at LinkedIn, and there's a lot of freedom that you can move around. Like I'm a prime example. I moved from Android to iOS to backend in like a period of 2 years, and that usually doesn't happen. But not just that, but you would have those conversations with your peers and your manager where everyone realizes like you're not going to stay at LinkedIn forever, but everyone is trying to set you up that wherever you go next is something that you're already prepared for during your time here. Like your skills and the stuff that you gain, not just from a skill standpoint, but working with others and someone who was fresh out of college who came to LinkedIn. That was something that I found super valuable.
Masha, do you have anything else to add? I guess thanks Siddhant for introducing us.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Thanks Ayush. Cheers.
Cheers.